Well, it's Groundhog Day. Again. And that must mean that I am Professor Robert E.G. Black. And this is the Groundhog Day Project.
It's like we're stuck. You know, like a needle on a scratch record.
It's one of those infinite time loop situations you might have heard about.
It's a thing where the same day keeps happening?
I wake up every day right here, right in Punxsutawney, and it's always February 2nd.
Time. I promise to explain everything later, but I need you to trust me.
Slow down! What are you, in a damn time loop or something?
Ostensibly, this episode is Groundhog Day Project Day 242, dated 31st March 2014, like a jerk again. But instead of getting right into it, I'm going to start with another paragraph from Benesh. Continuing after the paragraph I included at the beginning of the last episode. Phil Connor's desire to ingest the groundhog seems a parallel to his early hostile come-ons toward Rita, the allusions to his pelvic tilt, and to her sleeping alone and missing him, followed by his attempts to seduce her. With both of them, the groundhog and Rita, who ultimately becomes his role models and inspirations, he at first wants to be close. But is she suggesting the groundhog's his role model? I think there's a parallel between the two Phils early on and later Phil is becoming more like Rita, yes. Don't think that makes the groundhog his role model or his inspiration. A common problem with me and Benesh is I see what she's going for, but I don't always agree with the conclusions. Or I agree with the conclusions, but not the process. One or the other. He at first wants to be close by dominating the other, but still, he wants to be close, if only to consume and conquer. He is paying attention and even expressing potentially vulnerable desires, albeit in an aggressive manner. What one eats becomes a part of one, and mating can result in offspring that combine one's attributes with the other. If one is close enough to affect someone else, they are also close enough to be affected by the other. Rita's question in the Punxsutawney Phil abduction scene,
why would anybody steal a groundhog?
Interestingly, is answered by Larry.
I could probably think of a couple of reasons. Herbert.
This suggestion that Phil Connors wants to mate with Punxsutawney Phil explicitly associates Phil's efforts to get close to Rita with his efforts to get close to Punxsutawney Phil, and as we see, even to die with him. Yeah, there's an assumption of purpose there that I don't think fits with the film. He's not trying to get close to Punxsutawney Phil, he's trying to get rid of him. He is imagining that his movie has a plot, and that the time loop has a reason and has a trigger. He's wrong. Anyway, day 242. Like a jerk again. This is from yesterday. Benesh writes about references to eating the groundhog. Phil says,
I had groundhog for lunch.
And he reports about how the people of Punxsutawney
They used to pull the hog out and they used to eat it.
She adds one more. In another reference to ingesting the other, Phil Connors once proposes toasting the groundhog. I don't know how it works in Benesh's circles, but whenever I have been present for a toast, we have not then eaten the person or thing being toasted. Still, there's a pink tab here labeled Eating Groundhog. She continues. Phil Connor's desire to ingest the groundhog seems a parallel to his early hostile come-ons toward Rita, the allusion to his pelvic tilt and to her sleeping alone and missing him, followed by his attempts to seduce her. Hey, it's the paragraph I just read. Because clearly Phil wants to eat Rita, and I'm using eat in the literal sense. This is what Benesh is implying. I know she is suggesting or trying to suggest digestion as a metaphor, but she isn't quite getting to her point clearly enough here. Instead, Phil wants to eat the groundhog because he toasts to it and wants to eat Rita because I don't know. Her very next sentence probably says it better than the whole bit so far. She writes, with both of them, the groundhog and Rita, who ultimately become his role models and inspiration, he at first wants to be close by dominating the other, but still he wants to be close, if only to consume and conquer. Let me backtrack slightly. I mentioned yesterday how Benesh counters Phil's supposed liking of high places and being inflated and full of hot air, with the groundhog being lowly, humble, and grounded despite his being lauded by the town. I can accept the idea that an underground dwelling rodent is grounded, even if it does read as a bit on the nose, but I think it is presumptuous to suggest that Punxsutawney Phil is humble. The furry little guy has been demanding attention once a year for well over a century, and he's got a circle of human minions who transport him around, and a climate-controlled abode in the public library. It gets worse. Phil not only wants to eat the groundhog, but he wants to have sex with it. Benesh writes, Rita's question on the Punxsutawney Phil abduction scene, why would anyone, oh, she's misquoted, I corrected her, quote, wow, I'm a nitpicking bastard. Why would anybody, steal a groundhog? Interestingly, is answered by Larry, I can probably, she didn't include the probably, think of a couple of, she didn't include the of, reasons. Pervert? This suggestion that Phil Connors wants to mate with Punxsutawney Phil explicitly associates Phil's efforts to get close to Rita with his efforts to get close to Punxsutawney Phil, and as we see, even to die with him. Except, no. In fact, structurally the film sets it up so that these two things have very little to do with one another. Phil wants nothing to do with the groundhog. In the original screenplay, the line Gus says in the tip top,
Phil, like the groundhog, Phil?
Happens numerous times and Phil Connors is bothered by it every time. Still, he responds,
Yeah, like the groundhog, Phil.
Reluctantly, he admits he has something in common with the groundhog, but he makes no effort to get near the groundhog except to kill it. If Benesh is correct, actually the film suggests that she is more correct than the original screenplay does, since Phil only actually gets near the groundhog once and then to kill them both. In the original script, Phil stalks and tries to kill the groundhog well before he has sunk into suicidal depression. He goes after the groundhog out of desperation and anger. In the film, all of these feelings are rolled into one sequence. Phil is depressed after failing to get close to Rita, so he tries to end the time loop to end the curse. I don't mean to necessarily argue with Benesh here. Actually, I think she's getting at an important point. But her hands are tied by her choice to go with the reproductive metaphor and the digestive metaphor and the respiration metaphor without, or so she suggests, a textual analysis of the film. My yellow tab on this page is labeled Consuming Mating. And I think the suggestion that these two processes can be figuratively one and the same is an important one to make here, because Phil's attempt on date night to practically become Rita by adopting all of her favorite things and all of her dreams as his own is about him not only mating with Rita, but, metaphorically, consuming her, becoming her. This is quite important in understanding how Phil can get to the point that he is suicidal not because the time loop itself is beating him down, but specifically, he has been beaten by his own pursuit of Rita. Essentially, consumption equals consummation. I'm not sure if that line's clever. Anyway. Oh, origin of consume. Middle English from Middle French or Latin. Middle French consumer from Latin consumere. From com, sumere, to take up, take from sub up. Sub up? From sub up? Plus emer, to take. First known use 14th century. Origin of consummate. Middle English consummat, fulfilled. From Latin consummatus, past participle of consumere. To sum up. Finish. From com plus summa, sum. First known use 1527. Phil, then, is not failing to win over Rita, but to transform himself. And this is an argument Benesh should appreciate since her overarching topic is transformation. Date night is not about Phil trying to seduce Rita. Phil is trying to become someone who doesn't need to seduce Rita. He is trying to not be himself.
I don't even like myself.
But he fails, ironically, because he tries too hard. Instead of just being a better person, a better version of himself, he lies about who he is. Lying about who he is doesn't really change anything, so of course he cannot succeed in seducing Rita or changing himself. And in failing to do either, but especially the latter, he has not only not escaped the curse of the time loop, but he has actually made matters worse. As Hannum, 2008, describes it, Phil is suffering from the Groundhog Day effect. Hannum describes the Groundhog Day effect like this. A repetitive pattern is not necessarily harmful. Civilization would collapse without the repetitive patterns necessary to the supply of food and energy. As an individual, a regular structure is fine if you are happy in your routine. The difficulty arises if you are not happy, if you are not at peace, if you see no magic in everyday life. It is not so much outer repetition but inner repetition, repetitive thought patterns, that create the Groundhog Day effect. When we are oblivious to the magic of everyday life, caught in destructive and repetitive thought patterns, our first tendency is often to blame our predicament on our jobs, where we live, or on our partners. We believe that by changing our external circumstances, we will break free from the loop. Phil's thought patterns haven't really changed. He was a bit of a jerk before, he was a womanizer before, and pursuing Rita he is still just that. even if he might be altering his individual actions and the individual things he says to make himself seem like something different. Inside, he is still the same guy. In terms of couples and marriage, Johnson 2008 writes of what she calls demon dialogues, the topics that can turn a bit too easily into arguments. She writes, "For all of us, the person we love most in the world, the one who can send us soaring joyfully into space, is also the person who can send us crashing back to Earth. All it takes is a slight turning away of the head, or a flip, careless remark. There is no closeness without this sensitivity. If our connection with our mate is safe and strong, we can deal with these moments of sensitivity. Indeed, we can use them to bring our partner even closer. But when we don't feel safe and connected, these moments are like a spark in a tinder forest. They set fire to the whole relationship. We get stuck on the same patterns over and over. The same potentially volatile topics rear their heads and things erupt. For Phil, he seems to be trying to fill the void in himself with something approximating love, but it mostly amounts to sex. And as he changes the outside of himself to manipulate Rita into his room, it is still a shallow pursuit of sex. There's a moment in the film I don't think I have ever mentioned on this blog before. As Rita looks around Phil's room and wanders specifically into the bedroom side, Phil actually attempts to block her path back out of that side of the room. He isn't forceful about it, but he does get in her way. Then she walks around him. In a darker film, things may have gone further there. But then Phil would have had even farther to go to dig himself out of the hole within himself to be a good person. I've said before, Phil is not trapped in Punxsutawney, but rather he was trapped in Pittsburgh, trapped inside himself. In Punxsutawney, even if just because he is there so long that he runs out of other options, he finally manages to transform himself and become someone better, to get out of the demon dialogue he's got going with his own id, out of the Groundhog Day effect that plagued his pre-loop life. Interestingly, with the mention of Phil's id there, I thought of my recent paper regarding Plato's charioteer myth and the modern visual trope of the shoulder angel and shoulder devil. It is the one paper, in 2 different incarnations now, in grad school so far that I didn't explicitly connect to Groundhog Day. I still probably couldn't squeeze the film into the paper, but I do think the paper could be squeezed into the blog at least. But with nearly 1,800 words I read today, I will leave that for another time. Today's reason to repeat a day forever, to let the black horse win, to let the white horse win, and to let the charioteer have his hedonistic moments as well as his ascetic moments, and to find the balance. Which is to say, more generically, to be just like Phil Connors all the way to becoming a better version of myself.
Most of life is just junk, right? It's filler. And then there's these moments.
It's a perfect day. You couldn't have planned a day like this.
Well, you can. It just takes an awful lot of work.
When all the randomness turns into something perfect. It's like life's dropping all the bullshit just for a second to show us how amazing it could be all the time if it wanted to.
I don't know. I think maybe we're supposed to become like better people. Though I honestly don't even know how that could be possible.
Whoa, now. Sounds like someone's got a case of the time loop blues.
Ever think about it? We must miss so many of them. All those tiny perfect things are just poof, gone. Lost forever. But not today.
You can make right what once went wrong.
That is a disturbingly inspirational idea, Mark.
I know, but what is this? Some kind of time loop, like a gypsy curse? Is the universe giving us a cosmic test, or am I just going fucking crazy? Time.
The last revision is what counts, apparently.
What if we found them all? All the perfect things in this one town, in this one day. We could collect them.
Time loop of the week is a minor one. It is just a single moment in The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. The episode is called Doomed to Die. I think it was the penultimate episode of this second season. There's a battle raging outside. Celebrimbor is inside with Sauron, and the way Sauron tricks him into keeping on working is he creates a time loop of things happening so that from inside Celebrimbor thinks the light coming through the windows is regular daylight. It's a good day. There's no war outside. He catches on to it because there's this mouse that crawls across the floor, stops under a table, and then later crawls under the table and stops. Crawls under the table and stops. She's using a time loop as a trick. It's not the whole episode. It's just a piece of the illusion and part of his deception. He's creating a nice little moment for Celebrimbor to be stuck in it and not notice. But eventually, Celebrimbor notices anyway.
Knew you were gonna say that.
This has been a production of Lemming Drops Studio. You can find links to more at lemmingdrops.com or join the Facebook group Lemming Drops Studio Tour. Also, you can support all my shows at patreon.com/lemmingdrops.
What is wrong in the end which never comes? Or which comes again and again, lapping, like waves.
Since the Big Bang set everything in motion, everything that happens in this universe has to be the way it is. Particles unfolding the way they're destined to.
How do you sleep at night? You've never seen Groundhog Day?
Yeah, you know Groundhog Day is not a documentary.
Remember when Groundhog Day was just a movie?